So, you've got an event coming up, and you've decided on what deck you want to play, whether it be for fun or because you think it's the best strategy competition-wise. Now you have a new problem. What cards do you play? Your main strategy, or your engine, will be roughly the same across majority of the variants of your deck. You can figure out what good ratios and tech choices are by looking around at what other people have been seeing success with. Good ways to do this are to search for topping lists on YouTube or on websites like Yugioh Pro Deck. There are generally not many cases where topping lists are playing totally incorrect ratios, so they make for a great starting point to work off of. So let's just jump right into it. I'm going to be using Voiceless as an example for my deck building process. I've personally never played Voiceless, but I've seen it enough times to get the gist of what to do and what the decks should generally look like. Like I said earlier, resources like Yugioh Pro Deck and YouTube are great for figuring out starting steps if you're not too familiar with a set of cards. So when you're building a new deck, generally it's a good idea to do so in this order. First, I like to add engine cards. These are the cards that are required for your core strategy and are typically included in majority of the variants of your deck. And then once you get that down, you'll have an idea of how much space you have left for sub-engines, consistency cards, extenders, more starters, and non-engine cards. So if we use Voiceless as the example, low is a great card. It gets us access to all the other Voiceless cards, so we want to play that at 3. Same goes for Saphira and the Barrier of the Voiceless Voice. Now we have the actual ritual cards. You don't want to open too many copies of Prayers or Skull Guardian because they can be bricks just on their own, so we're not maximizing on copies. We also get access to both of them through all of these other cards, so we don't need to play 3. Next, we'll want to add the soft bricks, which are Radiance and Blessing, usually only played at 1 since you can get them, like I said, with all of these other cards. And 1 copy of Saravis, and I guess we should look for the other Saravis. So this is kind of the general core for Voiceless Voice, at least to my knowledge. Like I said, I'm not like a seasoned Voiceless vet, but this is typically what you'll see in a Voiceless list. Next, we will want to add some cards to increase consistency. So something like Diviner of the Herald is really good in this deck. So we'll play 3 of that along with 1 Trias. This will help us get access to low, which gets the whole engine rolling. Now, as you can see, we have 21 slots filled here. And so that leaves us 19 spaces in our deck to add more consistency cards, a sub-engine if we want, and non-engine cards. So because we have so much space, and because this deck doesn't typically use its extra deck, we can very easily add Pot of Prosperity and not have to worry about it impacting our game plan too much. Then we're just going to finish fleshing out the consistency cards since we have so much space. We can add Pre-Prep. This is just a very generically good card for ritual decks. It's a very free +1. There's no reason not to play it. And then we should just finish fleshing out the cards to support what we have in here. So we should add a Herald of the Arclight and a copy of Entis to use as utility options for our Diviner. The next thing we're going to want to do is figure out if we want to play any variants of this deck. Now personally, I think the branded variant of this deck is very strong. You don't use your extra deck a whole lot, as I mentioned with Pot, so a card like Branded Fusion locking you doesn't really impact your game plan very much. Like, yeah, you can't go into Lynx or like the occasional Chaos Angel, but I think the upsides far outweigh the downsides of using those. So we're just going to add probably 2 Albion and 3 Branded Fusion. And then let's type Albaz here, and we can add in 1 Fallen of Albaz. We don't want to draw it. It's literally just so we can activate Branded Fusion. We'll also add in a Lubellion and a Mirror Jade. So we've added all of the good consistency cards that are available. We've included a sub-engine, which the point of a sub-engine is really to help fix consistency issues or to raise the ceiling of your deck. So good examples of this right now are the branded cards like we added here, or the Kashtira cards. Lately, many decks have started splashing one or the other into their builds. The cash cards really help decks like Snake Eyes or other Link decks raise their ceiling, play through more boards and hand traps, as well as continue extending their combo through cards like Dracosack and Link Climbing with Promethean Princess. Similarly, decks like Voiceless or branded Chimera, regular Chimera, whatever you want to call it, typically like to splash in 3 Branded Fusion and 1 to 2 Albaz, just because Branded Fusion helps their end board become stronger. You can potentially put up a negate if you play Dragoon. It also just helps get access to your main engine. So, like, the benefits here specifically for Branded Fusion is we can send Atreus or we can send Saphira, and that helps get like the Voiceless cards rolling a little bit better. Sub-engines are typically anywhere from like 4 to 8 cards, so you see in this case we have 4 cards with the Branded Fusion Albaz, and with the majority typically being power cards, i.e. the Branded Fusion, with like 1 to 2 soft bricks like Albaz. The sub-engine just has a bunch of power cards you want to see in your opening hand that make your plays a lot stronger. So the last main topic I want to cover for the main deck, at least, is non-engine. This basically comes down to hand traps versus board breakers. In the current format, Legacy of Destruction, it's very hand trap heavy meta right now. Most of the topping deck lists you'll see are hyper consistent with lots of 1-card starters and tons of non-engine space dedicated to playing hand traps. Because of this, board breakers are not as strong. People aren't funneling all of their resources into building like an unbreakable board. A lot of the strength behind turn 1 setups right now are a more mid-range board with layered interruptions, good follow-up, and hand traps to back it all up. Since you don't have full knowledge, majority of the time, you can't just go gung-ho and ignore blanks in the hand that you're unaware of. So you really have to take this into account when designing your deck list. There's basically 2 approaches you can take to combat this. Approach number 1 is to go with the meta and play anywhere from 9 to 15 hand traps, as well as like a bunch of 1-card starters and consistency cards to try and win the hand trap war and to get your engine rolling first. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this, but I can definitely understand why and when it's necessary. If your deck doesn't have a variant available that can like push through any board, any amount of hand traps, I would really recommend considering just joining the hand trap approach. It will definitely help weaken your opponent's first turn setup, making it much easier to push through if they don't have like a critical mass of hand traps of their own. It will also help back up your own board. Since you're not playing a ton of gas, you're like not going to be building a break my board kind of deck. So the hand traps to back up your own plays will definitely be helpful. The other approach you can take, which I personally prefer because I find it to be more fun, is to play a variant of your deck that's full gas. I say this mostly pertains to fusion decks, at least in like recent memory, since you have so many options for extenders, but this can definitely apply to different types of decks as well. As long as you're able to play sub-engines that help you play through more hand traps, I think playing a high engine count with a couple of really impactful board breakers is worth considering. In a meta where people are not on breakers, it can also be much more impactful. I know I'm kind of going back and forth on, board breakers being impactful versus not impactful enough. And I think it's very deck dependent on which side of the spectrum they fall on for each, individual deck. I think it also matters a lot on which board breakers you play specifically. Like if your deck is having trouble playing through the couple effect negates that are on field, like if you can't play through Appaloosa but you can play through everything else, then cards like Dark Ruler No More might just be your new best friend. Yu-Gi-Oh is really such a great mind game when it comes to intricacies like this. Your opponent might be playing around like a hand trap combo or something on a really important choke point for them and end on a less optimal end board, only to get smoked by something like evenly matched or Dark Ruler like I just mentioned. And then you're more or less able to play for free, because if your deck doesn't really care that much about hand traps, then they're obviously not going to affect you that much. So if we hop back into this Voiceless build here, we have 9 slots left. We're just going to fill them up with hand traps because personally I think board breakers are not the move in this deck. You can definitely side them for specific matchups, but these hand traps are so impactful right now. Like these are, I think, the golden 3. Ash, Impermanent Veiler are just the best all-around generic hand traps right now. Obviously, you can side different hand traps for different matchups where they might apply more pressure, but this is kind of the idea that I would go with at the current moment. Alright, there's just a handful of topics left that I want to cover before I wrap this video up. This next one I feel is pretty important. It's consistency versus having a higher ceiling. Now this is one that I find myself struggling with a lot personally. I think it's pretty obvious that most people want their deck to have the highest ceiling. Crazy combos are one of the most fun things you can do in Yu-Gi-Oh, but that's not always the correct call. Sometimes it's definitely overkill to include so many engine cards that do more than you need it to. What I mean by this is sometimes your deck's standard line of play is more than enough and it's not worth playing the bricks required to hit that higher ceiling. It's more optimal to do the standard easier line more consistently over the course of a tournament than it is to get those pop-offs every couple of games. For every game that you're able to go crazy, you will also have games where you just brick hard and you can't play, and obviously that's not a great feeling. Everybody hates bricking. This means you'll want to consider adding consistency cards to your deck in order to help make sure you can reliably make the plays you designed your deck to do. Another topic I wanted to just quickly brush over is extra deck choices. There's a lot of times where your extra deck can be rather tight on space and you'll only have a couple of flex spots. This is where you need to do an analysis of what your deck lacks. Does it need more utility? Cards like Tifon and Underworld Goddess have your back. If you lose really easily to floodgates that are popular at the moment, then maybe it's worth including a card like Nightmare Phoenix. If you struggle to close out games, maybe you can fit in an access code line. If your deck has popular attributes used in the meta, you can make use of the Charmers. Those are really great as well. The options you have for your last few slots really depend on your deck's core strategy and what it's able to do. It's worth noting that if your deck is able to make rank 4s, the amount of choices you have for these slots is significantly larger. The rank 4 pool has so much utility that you can really find almost anything to put in there. You could even consider playing like a small Nemesis package with Infernal Flame Banshee, Nemesis Flag, Corridor and Colossus, or Protos, depending on how often you find yourself banishing cards. Now the last thing I want to cover before I wrap this video up is dealing with counters for your deck. Dealing with counters can be tricky. If your deck instantly folds to something like Jordan Lockbird, Dimension Shifter, or Dimensional Barrier, it might be worth considering including a card like Crossout Designator in your deck, provided that they're popular tech choices at the time. You could also consider extra deck cards like Baguska to pseudo turn skip and then try again on the next turn. A lot of the time, dealing with counterplay comes down to how well you know your cards in and out. That also goes hand in hand with how you constructed your deck in the first place. The more you play and practice with a build, the more comfortable and confident you'll get in dealing with these types of scenarios. Side decking is usually the delegated answer for these kind of hard matchups that you might have, but I'm going to leave that as a future video of its own because I feel it's a pretty important topic to cover that I haven't seen addressed very much yet online. What tips and tricks do you have for deck building? If I missed anything important, make sure to drop a comment down below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.